73 confirmed kills in a single tour of Vietnam. That number should have made him the deadliest sniper of the entire war, more lethal than Carlos Hathcock, more efficient than any American marksman who ever pulled a trigger in Southeast Asia. But here's the thing, you've never heard his name, and that's not an accident, that's a cover-up. Somewhere in the Pentagon, there's a filing cabinet with documents that were never supposed to see the light of day. Documents that prove an Australian sheep farmer with an outdated rifle outperformed every single sniper the United States military could produce. And for 50 years, they tried to erase him from history. Why would the most powerful military on Earth spend 5 decades hiding the achievements of an Allied soldier? What was so threatening about one man from Queensland that Washington decided the world could never know his name? And what did the Viet Cong know about him that the Pentagon desperately wanted to keep secret? Today, we're pulling back the curtain on one of the most shameful cover-ups in military history. A story of jealousy, lies, and a ghost who haunted the jungles of Vietnam while his own allies plotted to make sure he was forgotten. Stay until the end, because what you're about to learn will change everything you thought you knew about sniper warfare, about American military supremacy, and about the lengths the Pentagon will go to protect a myth. This is the forbidden kill record they tried to delete. The morning mist hung low over the long, high mountains when the first shot cracked through the jungle canopy, and somewhere in a classified filing cabinet at the Pentagon, a name was about to become the most inconvenient secret of the entire Vietnam War. His name was Ian Robertson, a sheep farmer's son from Queensland who had never fired anything more powerful than a rabbit rifle before 1965. And yet within 18 months he would accumulate a confirmed elimination count so staggering that American military intelligence would spend the next 5 decades trying to pretend he never existed. 73 confirmed terminations in a single tour, and that number represents only what the Australian Defence Force was willing to put on paper. The Americans had their own snipers in Vietnam, legendary figures like Carlos Hathcock with his white feather, and his 93 confirmed takedowns. But what the Pentagon never wanted the public to know was that an Australian farm boy operating with a fraction of the resources had quietly surpassed those numbers, using methods so unconventional that they defied everything written in the U.S. Marine Corps Sniper Manual. But this was only the first crack in a dam of secrets that would take 50 years to break. The year was 1966, and the 1st Australian Task Force had just established its base at Nui Dat, in Phuoc Tuy Province, a region the Americans had essentially written off as ungovernable. A Viet Cong stronghold so deeply entrenched that 3 U.S. infantry divisions had failed to pacify it. And yet the Australians arrived with barely 4,000 men and a radically different philosophy of warfare. Where American doctrine emphasized overwhelming firepower, helicopter insertions, and body counts measured in the thousands, the Australian SAS operated on a principle their commanders called the Ghost War. Long-range reconnaissance patrols that could remain invisible in the jungle for 10 days at a time, moving so silently that Viet Cong sentries would walk within arm's reach without ever knowing they were being watched. Ian Robertson was assigned to 3 Squadron SAS in March of 1966, and his patrol commander later recalled that the young Queenslander possessed an almost supernatural patience that set him apart from every other soldier in the unit. A willingness to lie motionless in the same position for 16 hours without shifting his weight, without swatting at the mosquitoes boring into his flesh, without surrendering to the cramping agony that forced lesser men to move. And it was precisely this patience that would transform him into something the Viet Cong had never encountered, something the Pentagon would desperately wish had never existed. The standard American sniper doctrine of the era emphasized what the Marine Corps called underscore, quote, _1. Underscore a philosophy built around the M40 rifle platform and engagement distances rarely exceeding 800 meters. But Robertson operated under entirely different parameters, often crawling to within 200 meters of enemy positions and waiting for targets that American snipers would have considered impossible. His weapon of choice was not the sophisticated American systems, but rather a modified L-42A1. The same bolt-action rifle British forces had used in Borneo, fitted with a commercial Pekar scope that American ordnance officers dismissed as hopelessly outdated. And yet this _2_ combination would prove devastatingly effective in the hands of a man who understood something that billion-dollar Pentagon research programs had somehow missed. The jungle was not an obstacle to be overcome with technology, but rather an ally to be embraced with patience. What Robertson discovered in those first weeks would rewrite everything the military establishment thought they knew about sniper warfare. Robertson's first confirmed elimination came on April 14, 1966, during a patrol near the village of Long Phuoc, when he spotted a Viet Cong officer coordinating a mortar team at a distance his patrol commander estimated at 175 meters. And what happened next would establish a pattern that American intelligence analysts would puzzle over for years. Instead of taking the shot immediately, Robertson waited for nearly 40 minutes, observing the officer's movements, memorizing his patterns, identifying the precise moment when the target would pause to consult his map, and when that moment arrived, the single round struck with such precision that the Viet Cong mortar team spent the next hour searching the tree line for a shooter who had already vanished. But this first blood was merely a whisper before the thunder that would shake the Pentagon to its foundations. The American military maintained an elaborate system of sniper confirmation, requiring multiple witnesses, photographic evidence when possible, and detailed after-action reports that fed into the statistical machinery of body count warfare. But the Australian SAS operated under a different philosophy that prioritized operational security over bureaucratic documentation. Robertson's patrol logs from 1966 reveal engagement after engagement where targets were eliminated without the elaborate confirmation procedures the Americans demanded. And this created a statistical anomaly that Pentagon analysts would later use to question whether his record was genuine. How convenient that the very absence of American-style documentation became the excuse for erasing his achievements from official history. The real conspiracy, however, was far darker than simple bureaucratic negligence. The truth was far more complex than simple record-keeping disputes, because Robertson's methods challenged fundamental assumptions about sniper warfare that the Pentagon had invested millions of dollars developing, and acknowledging his success would have required admitting that a sheep farmer with a 40-year-old rifle design had outperformed every technological innovation the American military-industrial complex had produced. His patrol commander, a captain whose name remains classified to this day, later provided a detailed account to Australian military historians that described Robertson's technique as something closer to Aboriginal hunting than anything taught at Fort Benning, a reference to the indigenous tracking methods that Australian SAS operators had studied extensively. Robertson would spend hours before each mission consulting with Aboriginal trackers attached to the Australian force, learning to read the jungle floor the way his targets read it, understanding where men would walk, where they would pause, where they would feel safe enough to lower their guard. And this ancient knowledge, passed down through 40,000 years of Australian wilderness, would prove more lethal than any weapon system the Pentagon could devise. By June of 1966, Robertson's elimination count had reached 23 confirmed, with an estimated additional 15 to 20 probable eliminations that could not be verified under Australian procedures, and word of his effectiveness had begun filtering back to American intelligence officers who could not understand how a single operator was producing results that entire U.S. sniper teams failed to match. The first American observer arrived at Nui Dat in July of that year, a Marine Corps captain attached to MACV's Studies and Observations Group, and his classified report would later become one of the most controversial documents of the entire war. What this American witnessed in the following weeks would haunt him for the rest of his life and terrify his superiors in Washington. Robertson's typical mission profile bore almost no resemblance to American sniper doctrine, beginning with an insertion method the Americans considered suicidally dangerous, walking into the jungle at dusk with nothing but his rifle, a water bottle, and enough rice to sustain him for 3 days. No helicopter insertion meant no noise signature, no landing zone that needed to be secured, no limitation on terrain accessibility, and Robertson exploited this freedom to reach positions that American snipers could never have occupied. The Marine Observer documented one mission where Robertson crawled for 11 hours through elephant grass and bamboo thickets to reach an overlook position above a suspected Viet Cong supply route, arriving at his hide site shortly before dawn and remaining motionless for the next 14 hours until 3 enemy porters appeared, carrying ammunition cases. 3 shots, 3 eliminations, and Robertson was already crawling back toward friendly lines before the echo of his final round had faded from the valley. But the Marine's report contained revelations so disturbing that his commanding officers immediately moved to bury it. Robertson's methods included practices that American military doctrine explicitly prohibited, including the retrieval of enemy equipment as what the Australian called __4_, and the deliberate positioning of eliminated targets in ways designed to maximize psychological impact on their surviving comrades. One passage from the classified report described how Robertson arranged 3 eliminated Viet Cong in seated positions around an extinguished campfire, their weapons placed in their laps, their wounds invisible from a distance, creating a tableau that the next enemy patrol would initially mistake for a rest stop. The psychological warfare value of such displays was immense, as Viet Cong units operating in Phuoc Tuy province began reporting encounters with __5_ the jungle ghost, a figure they believed possessed supernatural abilities. The enemy was beginning to fear a single man more than entire American battalions, and Washington had absolutely no idea how to respond. The American sniper establishment had built its entire doctrine around the principle of anonymous long-range elimination. The idea that a sniper should never be seen, never leave evidence of his presence, never allow the enemy to understand that they were being systematically targeted by a single individual. Robertson inverted this doctrine completely, deliberately cultivating a reputation among enemy forces, leaving signature evidence at elimination sites that Viet Cong intelligence officers would recognize, transforming himself from an anonymous threat into a personalized terror. The Marine Observer's report concluded with a recommendation that the Pentagon immediately dispatch a team to study Robertson's methods for potential incorporation into American sniper training programs, but this recommendation was never implemented. Instead, the report vanished into a classified vault where it would remain hidden for the next 4 decades, and the cover-up machine shifted into high gear. Why would the Pentagon suppress information that could have saved American lives and improved combat effectiveness? The answer lies in the uncomfortable intersection of military politics, institutional pride, and the peculiar dynamics of Allied force cooperation during the Vietnam War, where acknowledging that a Commonwealth ally had developed superior tactical methods would have required confronting fundamental assumptions about American military supremacy. The Marine Corps Sniper School at Quantico had spent years developing doctrine based on equipment, training protocols, and operational concepts that represented enormous institutional investment, and Robertson's success challenged every element of that doctrine. His rifle was inferior by American standards, his scope was outdated, his training had lasted mere weeks rather than the months American snipers spent in formal programs, and yet his results exceeded anything the Americans were achieving. This truth was so devastating to American military pride that destroying it became more important than learning from it. By September of 1966, Robertson's confirmed elimination count had climbed past 40, and Australian intelligence had begun receiving reports that Viet Cong headquarters in the region had placed a bounty on the jungle ghost, worth more than twice what they offered for captured American pilots. The enemy knew his general area of operation. They knew his approximate physical description from survivors who had glimpsed him at distance. They knew his methods well enough to train their sentries to look for his signature hide positions, and yet they could not stop him. 3 separate operations were launched specifically to eliminate Robertson, involving hundreds of Viet Cong troops combing the jungle for signs of his presence, and each operation ended in failure with additional casualties inflicted by the very sniper they sought. The hunter had become the hunted, and still he kept adding to his impossible tally, while the Pentagon plotted to erase him from existence. In October of 1966, a directive was issued from MACV headquarters establishing new protocols for the reporting of Allied force activities. Protocols that effectively ensured Australian SAS operations would be documented in ways that minimized their statistical impact on the overall war effort. The directive required all elimination reports from Australian units to be reviewed by American intelligence officers before inclusion in official databases, and these officers consistently applied standards of confirmation that reduced Australian numbers while inflating American figures. Robertson's confirmed eliminations, which Australian records placed at over 50 by this point, were reduced to 17 in American databases, a discrepancy that would persist for decades. This was not bureaucratic error, but calculated assassination of the historical record, executed with the same precision Robertson applied to his targets. The historical record now reveals that similar adjustments were applied to virtually every Australian SAS operator, whose performance threatened to outshine American counterparts, creating an official narrative that systematically understated Commonwealth contributions while amplifying American achievements. Robertson's 73 confirmed eliminations became 17. His probable eliminations were erased entirely, and his name was removed from the briefings that American officials received regarding Allied force effectiveness. But there was one group that kept meticulous records the Pentagon could never touch, and their files would eventually expose the entire conspiracy. Enemy documents captured after the war reveal that Viet Cong intelligence maintained detailed files on Australian SAS snipers, files that recorded elimination after elimination attributed to the Jungle Ghost, files that told a very different story from the sanitized American version. One captured document from November 1966 described Robertson as _quote, _6, a designation that no American sniper received during the entire war. Another document outlined defensive measures specifically designed to counter his methods. Robertson's final mission of his first tour came on December 19, 1966, during Operation Ingham, and what happened that day would become the most controversial engagement of his entire career. His patrol had been inserted near the village of Dat Do to gather intelligence on suspected Viet Cong troop movements, and Robertson had established a hide position overlooking a trail junction that Australian intelligence believed would be used for a major supply movement. For 22 hours, he waited, motionless, as monsoon rain soaked through his uniform and leeches attached themselves to every exposed surface of his body. And then the enemy appeared in numbers that exceeded anything his patrol had anticipated. Not a supply column, but an entire company. Over 100 Viet Cong soldiers moving in tactical formation toward what Robertson realized was an Australian defensive position that had no idea they were coming. What Robertson did next would become legend among those who knew, and the most heavily classified engagement of the entire Australian war effort. Robertson's official report states that he engaged the lead elements of the enemy column at maximum effective range, eliminating 7 targets before the company dispersed into the jungle, and that his fire provided sufficient warning for the threatened Australian position to prepare defensive measures that ultimately repelled the attack. But American intelligence officers who reviewed the engagement claimed the numbers were impossible, that a single sniper could not have eliminated 7 targets from a concealed position before being located and suppressed by over 100 enemy soldiers. The Australian Defence Force stood by Robertson's account, conducting a detailed post-action investigation that confirmed each elimination through physical evidence and survivor testimony. But the American objections ensured that this engagement would never appear in official Allied force histories. 7 confirmed eliminations in a single engagement. 7 truths the Pentagon declared impossible simply because admitting them was unacceptable. Robertson departed Vietnam in January of 1967 with 73 confirmed eliminations, a record that would have made him the most successful sniper of the entire war if American officials had been willing to acknowledge Australian statistics. Instead, he returned to Queensland to discover that his achievements had been classified under both Australian and American security protocols, forbidden from discussing his service with anyone outside the military, transformed from a living legend into a secret that both governments preferred to forget. The Pentagon's strategy was simple and effective, ensuring that no American journalist would ever compare Robertson's numbers to those of celebrated American snipers like Carlos Hathcock or Chuck Mohiney, ensuring that the narrative of American sniper superiority would remain unchallenged. But secrets, like bodies buried in shallow graves, have a way of eventually rising to the surface. In 1971, an Australian journalist named Peter Gross obtained partial access to Robertson's service record while researching a book on Australian SAS operations, and what he discovered prompted him to file Freedom of Information requests that would take nearly a decade to process. The Australian Defence Force initially denied the existence of any records matching Robertson's description, then acknowledged that records existed but were classified under national security provisions, then finally admitted in 1979 that portions of the record could be released with extensive redactions. What emerged from those blacked-out pages would send shockwaves through the military history community and set off alarms in Washington. Even with massive sections redacted, the surviving text confirmed elimination numbers that exceeded any Australian sniper in any conflict, methods that challenged conventional doctrine, and evidence of systematic American efforts to suppress information about Australian effectiveness. The Pentagon responded to the Australian disclosures with a tersely worded statement asserting that certain Allied force claims from the Vietnam conflict remain unverified under standard American confirmation procedures, a bureaucratic formulation designed to cast doubt without directly contradicting Allied records. But Robertson himself remained silent, bound by security oaths that he would honor for another 2 decades, watching as the truth about his service was debated by historians who had never spent a single night in the jungle. The full revelation, however, was still decades away, locked behind classification stamps and bureaucratic stonewalls. The complete story did not emerge until 1998, when the Australian government conducted a comprehensive review of Vietnam War records in preparation for a national memorial project, and researchers discovered discrepancies between Australian operational records and the American databases that were supposed to contain the same information. The review panel documented over 300 instances where Australian elimination figures had been reduced or eliminated entirely from American records, with Robertson's case representing the most extreme example of systematic statistical manipulation. His 73 confirmed eliminations had been reduced to 17. His service decorations had been filed under restricted access, and his name had been removed from every unclassified document that mentioned Australian SAS sniper operations. The Pentagon had not merely ignored his achievements, but had waged a deliberate campaign to ensure the world would never know his name. Ian Robertson finally broke his silence in 2003, granting a single interview to an Australian military historian that was published in a limited edition academic journal with minimal circulation. In that interview, he described methods that American sniper programs would not adopt until decades after the Vietnam War, including the use of environmental camouflage rather than ghillie suits, the exploitation of natural terrain features rather than constructed hide positions, and the integration of indigenous tracking knowledge into target selection protocols. He spoke without bitterness about the Pentagon's efforts to suppress his record, suggesting that institutional dynamics inevitably favored domestic achievements over Allied contributions. But his final words in that interview carried a blade sharp enough to cut through 50 years of official lies. "The Americans spent billions developing sniper technology while we just learned to be patient," Robertson said, summarizing in a single sentence the philosophical gap that separated Australian methods from American doctrine, the gap that the Pentagon had spent 50 years trying to hide. His story represents more than individual achievement because it illuminates a pattern of systematic suppression that affected countless Australian and Commonwealth operators whose contributions to the Vietnam War were deliberately minimized to protect American narratives of military superiority. The documents exist, scattered across classified archives in Canberra, Washington, and London, waiting for historians with the persistence to connect fragmented records into a coherent picture of what really happened in the jungles of Phuoc province. 73 confirmed eliminations by a sheep farmer's son with an outdated rifle, and an entire government machinery mobilized to pretend it never happened. Today, Ian Robertson lives in quiet retirement in regional Queensland, his name unknown to the American military enthusiasts who celebrate snipers like Carlos Hathcock without ever learning about the Australian who surpassed him. The Pentagon's cover-up succeeded for 5 decades, ensuring that generations of American soldiers trained in sniper programs that ignored Australian innovations, programs that might have been transformed if institutional pride had not outweighed practical effectiveness. How many lives might have been saved if the Pentagon had acknowledged Robertson's methods instead of burying them? How many American snipers struggled with techniques that Australian operators had already perfected? How many classified documents still contain secrets about Allied force contributions that the Pentagon decided were too embarrassing to acknowledge? These questions have no comfortable answers, but the time has finally come for them to be asked. The jungle ghost of Phuoc province earned his place among the greatest snipers in military history. And for 50 years, the Pentagon tried to delete him from that history. They failed, because the truth has a way of eventually finding its voice. And now the forbidden record finally stands revealed for anyone willing to confront the uncomfortable reality that American military supremacy was never quite as supreme as the Pentagon wanted the world to believe. Ian Robertson, the Australian farm boy who became a legend the Pentagon tried to erase, has finally received the recognition that was stolen from him for half a century. And somewhere in Washington, in a vault that was never supposed to be opened. The documents that confirm every single one of his 73 eliminations are still waiting to tell their story. That day of full disclosure is coming, and when it arrives, military historians will be forced to rewrite the entire narrative of sniper warfare in Vietnam. The forbidden elimination record was never really forbidden, because it was untrue. It was forbidden because it was too true. Too challenging to American assumptions. Too threatening to institutional investments. Too inconvenient for a Pentagon that had built its entire sniper doctrine on foundations that one Australian sheep farmer had already proved were unnecessary. 73 confirmed eliminations, and every single one was a truth that the Pentagon tried to delete from history. They are deleted no longer, and the jungle ghost has finally stepped out of the shadows.